It was early on Christmas morning when the phone rang. Not the kind of early that pulls you from deep sleep. I'd already been awake for hours. I'm one of those people who wakes before the sun without needing an alarm. Most mornings, I make coffee, sit by the window, and let the quiet seep in. But this morning, the phone broke that quiet. When I saw the name on the screen, I didn't hesitate. Dad? Clara's voice came through with a warmth I hadn't felt in a while. Merry Christmas. It caught me off guard, not because I didn't expect to hear from her, but because something in her tone felt younger. Like the way she used to sound before life got busy, before calendars became more crowded than the conversations we had. Merry Christmas, Clara, I said. You're up early. She laughed softly. I wanted to call before the day got away from me. Anne. I was thinking, you should come down for a visit. I could pick you up from the airport today. For a moment, I didn't answer. It's not often you get an invitation like that out of the blue, especially on Christmas Day. I imagined her in their kitchen, maybe still in her robe, coffee in hand, smiling as she thought of the idea. That's a nice thought, I said. I wouldn't want to intrude on your plans. You wouldn't be intruding, she replied quickly. Martin's family will be around later, but it'd be good to have you here. I'll be at the airport. Just tell me the flight. There was a slight pause, barely noticeable, before she spoke again. Not the kind of pause you'd think twice about in casual conversation, but I've always been attuned to the spaces between words. I let it go. My name is Edward Hale. I'm 60 years old. I've worked at Fairweather and Company, a mid-sized shipping firm, for 37 years. I booked the ticket within the hour. The flights weren't too crowded, which felt like a small Christmas gift in itself. As I packed, I caught myself feeling something I hadn't in years, anticipation. The kind that makes you fold shirts neatly and double-check your travel documents twice, even when you know they're already in the bag. On the way to the airport, I thought about the last time I'd spent Christmas with Clara. It had been 6 years ago, just after her wedding. Back then, she'd been full of plans and stories, eager to share them with me. We'd cooked together, laughed at old family jokes, even gone for a long walk in the snow. I'd held on to that memory like a keepsake, pulling it out whenever I missed her. The taxi driver asked if I was visiting family. I told him yes, my daughter. He smiled and said, best way to spend Christmas. I agreed. By the time I checked my bag and made my way to the gate, I could already picture the moment I'd see her, maybe holding a little sign for fun, maybe just waving as she spotted me in the crowd. I imagined we'd grab lunch, maybe walk around the city, catch up on everything we'd missed. On the plane, I stared out the window most of the flight. The clouds looked like fresh snow from above. I thought about the years I'd spent working late shifts and early mornings, all the sacrifices I'd made so Clara could have choices I never did. There's a certain comfort in believing your efforts quietly shaped someone's life for the better. We landed on time. I stepped off the plane, collected my bag, and made my way to the arrivals area. It was busy, families hugging, kids running toward grandparents, friends greeting each other with loud joy. I found a spot where she'd be able to see me easily. I wanted to be in her line of sight the moment she walked in. I kept scanning the crowd. Every time I saw someone with her height, her hair color, I straightened up slightly, thinking it might be her. But it wasn't. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then another. I checked my phone. No new messages. I called once, straight to voicemail. I tried again later, same result. My mind searched for explanations. Traffic. A dead phone battery. Last-minute changes. Still, the pause in her voice from that morning echoed in the back of my mind. I stayed until the crowd thinned and the airport grew quieter. My suitcase felt heavier on the way back to the taxi stand. In the cab, the driver asked if my family had surprised me at the airport. I smiled faintly and said, "Not exactly." And just like that, the anticipation I'd carried all day had dissolved into something quieter. Something I didn't yet have a name for. When the plane touched down, I felt that small rush of relief that always comes after a smooth landing. The kind where you glance around at the other passengers and share the same unspoken thought, "We've made it." I followed the steady stream toward baggage claim, wheeling my carry-on beside me. The December air coming in through the doors carried that sharp, clean bite I've always liked. It reminded me of winters from years ago, when Clara and I would walk home from the park with our breath puffing out in small clouds. I'd chosen a spot near the middle of the arrivals area, close enough to the entrance to see her coming, far enough from the crowd so she could spot me right away. I wanted her to see me before I saw her. I imagined her face lighting up, that quick wave she used to give as she crossed a room toward me. Minutes passed. The stream of travelers slowed, then came in uneven trickles. I shifted my bag from one hand to the other and checked my phone. No messages yet. I told myself she was parking. Maybe the lot was full. Maybe traffic had been worse than she'd expected. It was Christmas, after all, people were rushing from one obligation to another. Another 20 minutes went by. Families reunited all around me. Children barreled into grandparents' arms. Couples laughed over awkwardly balanced gift bags. I stood there, watching strangers have the moment I thought I was about to have. I called her. Straight to voicemail. I tried again 5 minutes later. Same thing. I leaned against the metal railing, scrolling idly through my phone to make it look like I had something else to do. My mind began pulling in small details from the morning, the way her voice had sounded warm, but slightly measured, that faint pause before she confirmed she'd meet me. I reminded myself that not everything had meaning. People pause for all kinds of reasons. An hour passed. I started looking at the airport differently, not as the place where she would appear, but as a kind of holding pen. My suitcase, once neatly packed and full of expectation, now felt heavier each time I adjusted its handle. I walked to the cafe near the exit and bought a coffee I didn't really want. Sat at a small table where I could still see the doors. Told myself maybe she'd had to turn around to grab something at home. Maybe she'd overslept, though the early call that morning made that unlikely. Every explanation I came up with seemed just plausible enough to keep me from leaving. By the second hour, my calls had gone unanswered too many times to be accidental. Text messages stayed unread. My coffee had gone cold. I've always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, especially the people you love. I've also learned that the benefit of the doubt, if stretched too far, can start to feel like you're making excuses for them. I stayed until the space around me emptied. The once busy terminal quieted, as if the day had moved on without me. I finally walked to the curb outside, pulling my coat tighter against the wind. The taxi line was short. The driver, a man about my age, gave me a polite nod as I got in. "Family pick you up?" he asked. I looked out at the traffic before answering. Not this time. He didn't press for more, and I was grateful. The ride to the hotel was quiet, but my thoughts weren't. I tried to place this moment in context, to figure out whether it was a one-off, an accident, or something that belonged to a bigger pattern I hadn't wanted to see. I thought about the holidays when Clara was a child, when she would wait at the window for me to get home from work, rushing to open the door the moment my car pulled up. I thought about the years after she married Martin, how our time together had grown shorter, our conversations more formal. The city lights passed in blurred streaks outside the taxi window. I imagined calling her again once I got to the hotel. Maybe she'd pick up. Maybe there'd be a perfectly reasonable explanation. But as we pulled into the hotel driveway, I realized that reasonable explanations don't usually leave you standing alone for hours in a public place without so much as a message. That night, I unpacked only what I needed. The rest stayed in the suitcase. I wasn't sure yet if I'd stay for the whole visit. Before bed, I checked my phone one last time. Still nothing from her. No missed calls. No texts. No apology. I turned off the light and lay back, staring at the ceiling. The day had started with anticipation and ended with a kind of quiet I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. Not yet. More like the faint chill that comes when you realize the warmth you expected may not be there at all. The morning after, I woke earlier than I needed to. Sleep had been light, the kind where you drift in and out without ever feeling truly rested. My first thought was to check my phone. Still nothing from Clara. No explanation. No apology. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, debating whether to call her again. A part of me didn't want to seem desperate for a response, but another part couldn't quite believe she would simply leave me waiting like that without reason. I dialed her number anyway. Straight to voicemail. I left a short message, "Clara, it's Dad. I made it in yesterday. Give me a call when you can." My voice was steady, but I kept it brief. There's no point in spilling hurt into a voicemail, it never lands the way you hope. The hotel breakfast room was half empty. I took a seat by the window, picking at toast while the TV in the corner played a muted news segment. I must have checked my phone every few minutes, each time expecting to see her name on the screen. By mid-morning, I called Helen Cross, an old friend who'd stayed in touch with Clara now and then. I told her I was in town, hoping she might know if Clara was all right. Helen sounded surprised. "I didn't know you were visiting. Thought you'd be home for Christmas." "I was supposed to be," I said. "Clara invited me down yesterday. Said she'd meet me at the airport." There was a pause on the other end, a real pause, not the kind you imagine. "That's odd," Helen said carefully. "Because I saw her Instagram yesterday. Looked like she and Martin were headed out with his family. Some kind of trip. Big group photo at the lodge." I felt something tighten in my chest, though my voice stayed even. "When was that posted?" "Yesterday afternoon. Around 2, I think." I thanked her and hung up. For a long moment, I just sat there in the quiet of my hotel room. It wasn't the photograph itself that bothered me. People go places, plans change, it was the timing. She'd spoken to me that morning, told me she would pick me up, and yet at some point between that call and my arrival, she'd chosen to be somewhere else entirely. There are mistakes people make without realizing. And then there are choices. This felt like a choice. I didn't call her again that day. Instead, I went for a long walk through the city. It was cold but clear, the kind of winter day where your breath hangs in the air like smoke. The streets were busy with last-minute shoppers, families weaving in and out of stores. I kept my hands in my coat pockets, letting my thoughts move as slowly as my steps. I asked myself what possible reason she could have had. Maybe Martin's family had pressured her. Maybe she hadn't known how to tell me she'd changed her mind. Maybe she thought I'd understand without needing to explain. But the truth is, understanding only works when both sides are willing to speak. That evening, I sat by the hotel window with a cup of tea, watching the lights flicker on in the buildings across the street. I thought back over the last few years, missed calls that went unreturned, invitations that came later and later each holiday season, conversations that felt more like updates than real exchanges. It hadn't always been this way. But somewhere along the line, my place in her life had shifted. I wasn't the first call anymore. Maybe not even the second or third. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was a quiet clarity, as if I'd been looking at a photograph slightly out of focus and was only now seeing it for what it was. Before turning in for the night, I made one decision: I wouldn't chase her for explanations. If she wanted to speak to me, she would. And if she didn't, well, silence has a way of speaking for itself. Still, that image of the group at the lodge, Martin at the center, Clara to his right, smiling but not quite looking at the camera, stayed with me. Not because of what it showed, but because of what it confirmed. Sometimes, the truth doesn't arrive with fanfare. It just appears, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. In the days that followed, I didn't hear from Clara. Not a call, not a text, not even the simplest acknowledgement that I had come all that way. If I had been younger, I might have told myself she was busy, or that something had come up and she'd explain later. But with age comes a different kind of patience, the kind that doesn't confuse hope with denial. I began to notice that this wasn't an isolated incident. As I sat in the hotel lounge each morning with a cup of coffee, I thought back over the last several years. Birthdays that used to be shared over dinner had turned into short phone calls, sometimes just a message left on my voicemail. Invitations to visit had grown vague, and always with the caveat of, "We'll see if it works out." I hadn't wanted to see it before, but the distance between us had been building for some time. On the third morning, I called an old colleague, Samuel Green. We'd worked together for over 20 years before I retired. Samuel has a habit of speaking plainly, which I've always appreciated. I told him, without much detail, that I was in town visiting Clara and that plans had fallen through. "You always said she was a good kid," Samuel replied. "And she probably still is. But sometimes, people get absorbed into other lives. They stop looking back at the ones they came from." He said it without judgment, and I took no offense. The truth rarely offends me. That afternoon, I walked through a small park not far from the hotel. Children played on the swings, bundled in coats and hats, their laughter carrying in the cold air. Parents stood nearby, hands in pockets, eyes following their children's movements. Watching them, I realized I had once stood that way for Clara, always looking out, always ready to step in if she stumbled. And now, she was old enough to decide whether to look back for me at all. I still hadn't decided what to do about it. My first instinct was to wait and let the matter rest. But that's how these things often become permanent, not with a single decisive act, but with a series of quiet surrenders. On the fourth day, Helen called me back. She said she'd run into Clara briefly at the store. Clara had mentioned being away with Martin's family, but when Helen asked about me, she'd simply said, "Oh, it didn't work out." Didn't work out. That phrase sat with me for the rest of the day. It was vague enough to excuse her from further explanation, yet final enough to close the topic. I didn't call Clara after that. Instead, I began to write things down. Not a letter to her, not yet, but notes to myself. Observations. Small reminders of patterns I had ignored. Moments when her tone had shifted. Invitations that never materialized. Priorities that seemed to place me just outside the circle. The exercise wasn't about blame. It was about clarity. If I was going to respond, and I knew, even then, that I would, I wanted to do so with precision, not impulse. By the end of the week, I had enough entries to see a clear progression. It was like charting the slow bend of a river. The path might not change in a day, but over time, it moves far from where it began. I extended my stay at the hotel, telling myself it was simply to enjoy the city. But the truth was, I wasn't quite ready to leave. There was something unfinished here. And just so you know, if you've stayed with me in this story so far, it tells me you're patient enough to appreciate where it's going. That patience matters. So, if you want to follow it through to the end, you might as well like and subscribe. It keeps this conversation between us going. That small request aside, I returned to my notes. With each one I added, I began to think less about the hurt and more about the response. It wasn't about punishing Clara, that would be childish. It was about setting things right in a way that was fair, undeniable, and lasting. When you've lived long enough, you learn that silence can be louder than any accusation. But silence, applied strategically, can also change the balance of a relationship in ways words never could. I didn't yet know the exact shape my response would take, but I knew its qualities: quiet, precise, patient. And as I closed my notebook that evening, I realized something important. I wasn't waiting for her to call anymore. I was preparing. I had been in the city for nearly 2 weeks when the truth started to take shape. It didn't arrive in a dramatic revelation, but in a series of small, almost forgettable pieces, each one slipping quietly into place until I could see the whole picture. The first piece came from Helen again. We were having coffee at a small bakery she liked, and she mentioned, almost casually, that Martin had been given a promotion at his firm. She said it as a point of polite conversation, the way people talk about good fortune in others' lives. But I knew what it meant. I had worked in corporate long enough to understand promotions, the dinners that follow, and the people who are invited to them. Martin's promotion celebration had been on Christmas night. That was where Clara had been. I asked Helen if she'd been invited. She shook her head. No, I don't think it was a big thing. Just close family. She sipped her coffee and changed the subject. Close family. The second piece came the next day when I stopped at the bookstore. The owner, a man I'd met years ago through Clara when she worked there part-time, remembered me. He asked if I was still living out of town. I said yes. Clara was in here last week, he said. Said her dad might be coming for New Year's instead of Christmas. I guess you changed your mind? I told him I had not. The third piece was more subtle, but perhaps the most telling. When I finally heard from Clara, a short message on my phone, she didn't apologize. She didn't ask where I was staying or suggest we meet. She simply wrote, "Hope you're well. Been busy. Talk soon." That was when I knew the absence at the airport wasn't a mistake. It wasn't even neglect. It was an active choice. I spent that evening at the desk in my hotel room, reading over the notes I had been keeping. The timeline was clearer now. In the months leading up to Christmas, Clara had been pulling away not because of distance, but because of convenience. I had become an optional presence in her life, one she could acknowledge or ignore depending on what suited her in the moment. This wasn't the daughter I had raised. The temptation was to confront her, to demand an explanation, but I knew from experience that confrontation rarely yields truth. People defend themselves when they feel cornered. They tell the version of events that keeps them intact. I wasn't looking for her explanation. I already understood it better than she did. What I wanted was something else, a shift in the dynamic. Not a punishment, but a recalibration. A reminder, delivered without anger, that relationships carry weight, and that neglect has consequences. I started thinking about the practical levers in her life. Not emotional ones, I would never stoop to that, but tangible ones. Over the years, I had quietly supported Clara in ways she might have taken for granted. Advice on her mortgage when she and Martin bought their house. Small financial cushions when their first child was born. Connections to people in her field when she was trying to advance her career. None of these had been transactional. They had been acts of care. But acts of care can be withdrawn just as quietly as they are given. The realization didn't bring me pleasure. I didn't want to cut her out of my life. But I did want her to feel the absence in a way she couldn't dismiss as easily as she had dismissed me at the airport. The more I considered it, the more I saw that this wasn't about revenge in the cinematic sense. This was about balance. And balance, when restored, can feel like justice. That night, I made a list, not of grievances, but of every way in which I was currently an invisible presence in her life. Advice, introductions, even small habits like sending her articles I thought she'd find useful. All of it had accumulated over years, like quiet scaffolding holding up part of her world. When the list was done, I drew a line through each item. Not in anger, but in decision. The next step would be simple: stop doing them. No announcements, no warnings. Just a quiet removal of support. The kind that makes a person pause months later and think, when did that change? I closed my notebook, feeling the same stillness I had felt years ago when I negotiated my final contract before retirement, calm, steady, and certain. I wasn't moving against her. I was stepping back and letting her feel the gap. It would take time for her to notice. But I had time. In January, the city quieted. The lights came down from the lampposts, the shop windows returned to their usual displays, and the air seemed colder without the pretense of celebration. I had already returned home by then. It had been a silent trip back, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing more to say. The decision had been made. The work ahead required no announcement, only consistency. The first step was the easiest. I stopped reaching out. No articles sent, no check-in messages, no small reminders of things she needed to do. I left the calendar empty of my voice. The next step required more thought. Clara had been counting on me to review some legal paperwork related to their refinancing. She had mentioned it back in the autumn, assuming I would step in the way I always had. When the email from her arrived in late January, I let it sit unopened for 3 days. On the 4th, I wrote back a polite line, "I'm afraid I won't be able to help this time. I'm sure you'll find the right person to guide you." There was no explanation, no tone. Just a door quietly closing. Weeks passed before the next request arrived. This one came from Martin, a brief message about a potential job lead in my network. In the past, I would have made the call within hours. This time, I didn't. I replied that my contact was no longer taking referrals. Technically true, I hadn't asked. I didn't keep score, but I noticed the rhythm. Where once my role had been a constant, I was now absent. And absence, when consistent, becomes noticeable. The first sign that she felt it came in mid-February. Clara called out of the blue, her voice unusually warm. She asked how I was, how the weather had been, if I'd been keeping busy. She mentioned she'd been meaning to call sooner but time just got away. I answered each question simply, without offering more than necessary. Not cold, just light. She seemed to hesitate once or twice, as if expecting me to fill the silences the way I used to. I didn't. The call ended politely. But I could hear in her tone that she knew something had shifted, even if she couldn't quite name it. By March, the effects were clearer. A mutual acquaintance, Margaret, mentioned over lunch that Clara had been struggling with the refinancing paperwork. She had ended up hiring someone, a bit costly, but at least it's done. Margaret's comment was casual, but I noted it. Not with satisfaction, but with confirmation that the change was working as intended. The thing about removing support is that it's not about causing pain. It's about creating space where someone must stand on their own. Space they once assumed would always be filled for them. Around this time, I received an invitation to my grandson's school play. It was on a Friday afternoon, a time I couldn't attend without rearranging other commitments. In the past, I would have rearranged them without hesitation. This time, I didn't. I sent a warm message wishing him luck and told Clara to send me a photo. These were small actions, barely noticeable if taken alone. But strung together, they altered the foundation of our dynamic. The quiet reliability she had leaned on was no longer there. One evening in late March, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, thinking about the pace of it all. This was not vengeance. This was a steady redrawing of boundaries, boundaries I should have set years earlier. People often mistake restraint for passivity. But there is a kind of strength in choosing the slower path, in letting the absence speak for itself. I was learning to let the silence carry my message. Some nights, I would think back to the airport. The plastic chairs, the muted announcements, the way the crowd had thinned until it was just me. In a way, that moment had been a perfect rehearsal for what I was doing now, waiting, without chasing, until the other person decided whether to show up. I suspected it would take months before Clara realized the full extent of the change. That was fine. I had learned patience in my career, in my life, in every negotiation worth winning. And this wasn't about winning. It was about balance. By April, I began to notice something else. Her messages were becoming longer, her calls more frequent. There was an edge to them, not of anger, but of inquiry. She would slip in small reminders of things we had done together, ask about people from her childhood, bring up shared memories as if to pull me closer. I didn't push back, but I didn't rush forward either. The space between us remained. It occurred to me then that real change doesn't happen in the heat of confrontation. It happens in the slow recognition that the old rules no longer apply, and in the quiet reckoning that follows. I poured the last of my tea, feeling the calm certainty of someone who has set the right course and intends to keep it. The withdrawal was not complete yet. But it was working. By late spring, the first hints of recognition began to slip through her tone. It wasn't in what Clara said, but in the pauses. Those tiny, unfilled spaces after I answered her questions, spaces she used to let me fill, now left hanging just long enough to betray her thoughts. One evening in May, she called while I was reading in the living room. Her voice was lighter than usual, the kind of lightness people use when they're testing the temperature of water before stepping in. "Dad, I was just thinking about you," she said. "Feels like we haven't talked much lately." I told her I'd been busy. No elaboration, no list of errands or projects. Just the truth, distilled. The pause came then. Short, but telling. In the past, I might have filled it with reassurance, some explanation about how I'd been meaning to call, how time had gotten away from me. Instead, I let it rest between us. She moved on, asking if I'd heard about my grandson's science fair project. I said I hadn't, and she described it in detail. It was a pleasant conversation on the surface, but beneath it, I could hear something else, the awareness that my responses were measured now. Not unkind, but deliberate. After we hung up, I thought about how subtle shifts often take longer to notice than direct changes. You can ignore a single missed call. You can overlook one unreturned favor. But when the pattern becomes consistent, it's impossible not to feel the absence. In early June, I received an email from her about a problem with her homeowner's insurance. In the past, I would have researched solutions for her, written a list of next steps, maybe even called a contact to smooth the process. This time, I wrote a single line back: "Have you tried speaking to your broker? They should be able to guide you." 2 days later, she called me. "I talked to the broker," she said, "but it's more complicated than I thought." I told her I was sure she'd figure it out. And I meant it, she's capable. Always has been. But capability can go unused when someone else keeps doing the lifting. By mid-June, the tone of her messages had shifted. They were warmer, more intentional. She started sending short updates about her week, little glimpses into her life that she hadn't shared in years. Photos of my grandson's soccer games, snapshots of their new garden beds, even a picture of a meal she'd cooked. I appreciated these things, but I also recognized them for what they were, a reaching out. A recalibration. One Sunday afternoon, she called again. This time, there was no casual pretense. "Dad," she said after a bit of small talk, "is everything okay between us?" I let her words sit for a moment. Not to be dramatic, but because I wanted to answer with clarity. "Everything's fine," I said finally. "I've just been giving you more space." Another pause. Then, quieter, "I guess I didn't realize you thought I needed space." I didn't correct her. This wasn't about assigning blame. It was about letting her see the shape of the distance without pointing it out directly. We talked for a few more minutes, and I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. That, too, was new. When we hung up, I sat for a long while, thinking about the years behind us. The times I had stepped in without being asked. The reflex I had built of filling every gap, smoothing every rough edge before it could catch her. It had been done out of love. But love without boundaries can turn into expectation. By July, I noticed the shift had begun to influence her actions. She stopped asking for help quite as freely. She began telling me about things she had managed on her own. There was pride in her voice when she did. One evening, she told me she'd negotiated a lower rate on her insurance without needing anyone else to step in. She laughed a little when she said it, not the carefree laugh of before, but a softer, more grounded sound. "That's good," I told her. "Feels better when you handle it yourself, doesn't it?" There was no defensiveness in her reply. "Yeah, it does." The real change wasn't in the favors I withheld. It was in the way she was beginning to step into the space they left behind. By late summer, the pauses in her voice had a different quality. Not uncertainty now, but thoughtfulness. She seemed to be considering her words, noticing the give and take more clearly. This wasn't about her making amends. It was about her understanding the balance. And, quietly, I could feel something else taking shape, a steadier footing between us. It was working. By August, the rhythm between us had changed enough that I began testing it. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture, but with small, deliberate choices. When she called, I didn't always pick up right away. Sometimes I returned the call later that evening, sometimes the next morning. I let her sit with the space, just as I had. Her tone was different now, more attentive. She asked questions and waited for answers, no longer rushing past them to get to the part about her own troubles. She seemed to sense that I was no longer the ever-available resource she had grown used to. One Saturday morning, she called to invite me to a late lunch the next day. I said I'd have to check my calendar and call her back. The truth was, my calendar was clear. But the delay wasn't about punishing her, it was about ensuring she understood that my time had shape and value. When I confirmed a few hours later, she sounded genuinely pleased, as though she'd been unsure whether I'd say yes. That uncertainty was new. And healthy. At lunch, I noticed other small shifts. She asked how I was enjoying my retirement hobbies. She listened when I told her about a book I'd been reading, even asking for the title so she could look it up. She seemed more present in the moment, less distracted by her own mental to-do list. It would be easy to say I forgave her in that instant, to tie the story into a neat emotional bow, but that wouldn't be true. Forgiveness, I've found, isn't a moment. It's a process you measure in inches, not leaps. Later that week, she called about a minor plumbing issue. In the past, I might have driven over to take a look, tools in hand. Instead, I suggested she contact a local repair service. She didn't protest. In fact, she texted me later to say the work had been done and the plumber was surprisingly friendly. That small exchange told me more than she realized. She was adapting. Learning that she could solve her own problems without me stepping in first. By September, the changes began to feel less like temporary adjustments and more like a genuine pattern. She still reached out, but the conversations were no longer just about needs. She shared stories about her work, her friends, even asked my opinion on a recipe she was trying. I started to reintroduce small acts of help, but only when I felt the balance was right. A ride to the airport when her car was in the shop. An extra bag of groceries when I knew she'd been busy. Not because she asked, but because I chose to. That choice was important. It kept the power dynamic level. We both seemed to sense it, the unspoken agreement that our relationship would function better this way. Less automatic giving, more considered exchanges. One quiet Sunday afternoon, she called me out of the blue. There was no problem to solve, no errand to request. She just wanted to tell me that she and my grandson had gone hiking, and that he'd managed the steep hill without stopping once. I smiled, listening to her describe the trail. There was something almost symbolic about it, watching him climb on his own, hearing her pride in his independence. After we hung up, I sat for a while, thinking about how the same principle applied to her. The climb had been uncomfortable at first. There had been slips and pauses. But she was learning to stand on her own footing. It struck me then that this was never really about revenge, at least not in the way most people think of it. My goal wasn't to hurt her or make her pay. It was to restore something, to shift the balance so that both of us could stand without leaning too hard on the other. By early October, I realized I no longer felt that quiet ache of disappointment when her name appeared on my phone. The calls were no longer one-sided withdrawals. They had become deposits, too, of attention, of care, of shared moments that didn't demand a solution. A new pattern had formed. And it was one worth keeping. By late autumn, the air carried that crisp, unmistakable scent of change. The leaves had already dropped, and the neighborhood had gone quiet except for the occasional scrape of someone's rake against the sidewalk. I've always liked this season. It's neither the eager bloom of spring nor the harsh finality of winter, it's the in-between, where you take stock. That's what I found myself doing, more than once, as the year wound down. Taking stock. I could trace the events back easily, the call on Christmas morning, the hours waiting at the airport, the unanswered texts. A younger man might have let the bitterness calcify. But I'd been around long enough to know that letting something harden like that only makes it weigh you down. Instead, I had acted. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just with enough precision to tilt the balance in my favor. And it had worked, not in some grand, cinematic way, but in the small, consistent improvements I could see. Our conversations had become lighter. She spoke with more patience. When she did ask for help, she framed it as a request, not an expectation. And I noticed that she had started offering help in return, little things, like picking up coffee beans she knew I liked, or forwarding me an article she thought I'd enjoy. Some might not see those details as important. But I've learned that relationships are built and broken in the small moments. Grand gestures make for good stories, but it's the quiet habits that sustain you. One Saturday in November, I found myself at her place for dinner. She had cooked a simple stew, and the table was already set when I walked in. As we ate, she asked about my week. I told her about a neighbor's garden project, about a book I'd just finished, about a short trip I was planning. She listened. Not just politely, fully. There was a moment during dessert when she looked at me, unprompted, and said, "I know I wasn't there for you last year, Dad. I've been thinking about that a lot." It wasn't an apology wrapped in excuses. Just a quiet acknowledgement. I nodded, not needing to fill the silence. She didn't press the point, and neither did I. Sometimes the words are less important than the awareness behind them. When I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, not pride exactly, but a settled kind of relief. I had made my point without raising my voice, without burning the bridge. The structure was still standing. It was just, better built now. There's a misconception that revenge has to be destructive. That you must take something away from the other person to feel whole again. I've come to see it differently. The most effective revenge, the kind that stays with you, is about reordering the terms of the relationship. Making sure the other person knows, without you having to say it, that the old dynamic is gone. It's a shift you feel in the weight of the air between you. Of course, I never told her any of this. The work had been done quietly, and it would stay that way. Explaining it would have cheapened it, made it about proving a point instead of living one. In early December, almost a year to the day since that phone call, she invited me to her place again. This time, she said she'd pick me up. She was on time. The drive was comfortable. She asked about the weather in my area, about my plans for Christmas, about whether I'd been painting again. I told her I had, and she asked if I might bring one of my smaller canvases next time so she could see it in person. I didn't say yes right away. I smiled and told her I'd think about it. That little pause, the same kind I'd learned to use over the past months, reminded me that the balance was still in place. She noticed it too. Not with offense, but with a quiet understanding that nothing was automatic anymore. We had arrived at something sustainable. Something earned. When I stepped out of her car that evening, I stood for a moment on the driveway before going inside. The air was cold, my breath visible. Across the street, a neighbor was stringing lights on his fence, their glow reflecting off the frost. I thought about how the past year could have gone, the arguments we never had. The accusations never spoken. It would have been easier, in some ways, to have it out in one loud, messy confrontation. But then we might have lost the chance to rebuild on better ground. No, this way was better. The lesson had landed without the scar of a fight. And it would last. That, I decided, was the quiet satisfaction of it all. By the time the first snow of winter settled in, I knew the work was complete. Not the kind of completion you mark with a celebration or a final word, but the quiet sort, like tightening the last screw on a chair and knowing it will hold for years. I'd spent 12 months adjusting the balance between us. Not punishing her, not withdrawing entirely, but making sure every interaction was deliberate. I gave my time when it was respected, withheld it when it wasn't. I offered help when it was asked for with consideration, and declined when it came as an expectation. Over the year, these boundaries became the new framework. And without me having to spell it out, she had adapted. The final measure, if you could call it that, wasn't anything I planned as an event. It was a conversation, one that happened naturally, on a cold afternoon in mid-December. She called me, her voice warm but measured. "I wanted to see if you're free on Christmas," she said. I told her I was, but I wouldn't be flying anywhere this year. If she wanted to see me, she'd have to make the trip herself. My tone was calm, even friendly. It wasn't a demand, it was simply the way it was going to be. There was a pause. I could almost hear the recognition in it. Then she said, "All right, Dad. I'll come to you. I'll bring dinner." No defensiveness. No hesitation. Just acceptance. I hung up feeling the kind of satisfaction that doesn't rush through you, but settles in, like a fire you've built well, burning steady. On Christmas Day, she arrived mid-afternoon. The roads were icy, and she'd driven carefully, arriving with her cheeks flushed from the cold. She carried 2 bags, one with food, the other with a small wrapped gift. We spent the day without ceremony. No big speeches, no revisiting the past year's mistakes. The conversation drifted from books to work to the kind of easy family memories you don't need to embellish. I could tell she was paying attention in a way she hadn't before, not out of guilt, but out of understanding. At one point, while she was setting plates on the table, she looked over and said, "Thanks for having me here, Dad." A simple sentence. But I heard what she didn't say, "I'm glad we're okay." And we were. That evening, after she'd left, I stood by the window for a while, watching the snow drift in the streetlight. I thought about how revenge, if you strip away the drama, is just a correction. It's an adjustment to restore what was off balance. The rest is noise. What I had wanted wasn't for her to feel what I'd felt that day at the airport. I hadn't needed her to sit alone, waiting, wondering. What I wanted was for her to value my time, to approach our relationship with the same care I gave it. Now, she did. That was the final measure. Not the gift she brought, or the drive she made in the snow. It was the quiet fact that the weight between us was equal again. In younger years, I might have looked for more, a bigger apology, a deeper confession, something to make the ledger feel fully settled. But age has a way of softening that instinct. It teaches you that people rarely say the exact words you want to hear, and that waiting for them to do so is just another form of holding yourself hostage. No, the measure was in the change itself. Before I went to bed that night, I put her gift on the shelf without opening it. I'd open it later, when I felt like it. That, too, was part of the balance, not rushing to meet expectations. Even the quiet ones. Some might say this wasn't revenge at all. Maybe they'd be right. It was closer to course correction, done with patience and intention. But for me, it carried the same quiet satisfaction, and none of the regret. And that's the thing about this kind of approach, you get to keep the bridge. You just make sure it's built in a way that you're no longer the only one maintaining it. That's enough.